The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading Dad's will. My stepmother Linda sat smugly in the front row, already planning how to spend her inheritance. She had no idea that Dad had quietly moved $3.2 million into a trust 2 years earlier. My name is Michael Henderson, 36 years old, financial advisor from Portland, Oregon. My father, James Henderson, was a successful real estate developer who built a multi-million-dollar empire from nothing. When my mother Carol died 5 years ago from complications during surgery, Dad was completely shattered. We all were. For 2 years, Dad grieved alone. Then he met Linda Summers at a charity auction. She was 39, recently divorced, and everything my mother wasn't: flashy, demanding, and obsessed with luxury. Within 8 months, they were married at a destination wedding in Cabo that cost more than most people's houses. The change in Dad was immediate and concerning. Linda systematically began isolating him from his family and longtime friends. Sunday dinners that had been a tradition for 20 years suddenly became too stressful for Dad. Business meetings that once included me and my sister Rachel were now private affairs. "Your father needs to enjoy his retirement," Linda would say with her practiced smile. "All this business talk just creates unnecessary pressure." My sister Rachel, who had been Dad's bookkeeper for 8 years, found herself gradually pushed out of financial discussions. I was still Dad's investment advisor, but Linda would sit in on our meetings, taking notes and asking questions that seemed designed to understand Dad's complete financial picture. But we respected Dad's choice. Linda made him happy in ways we couldn't after Mom's death. If this was what he needed to move forward, we'd support it, even if it meant seeing less of him. That changed in March 2022 when Dad was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. The prognosis was grim, maybe 18 months with aggressive treatment. Linda's response was swift and controlling. She immediately appointed herself Dad's primary caregiver and began restricting our access to him. "The doctors say stress affects his immune system," she explained when we tried to visit. "Too many visitors overwhelm him. We need to be strategic about his energy." Family visits became scheduled appointments. Phone calls were screened through Linda. Even Dad's golf buddy of 30 years found himself unable to reach Dad directly. When I questioned this level of control, Linda would tear up and explain how overwhelming it was to care for a dying man. "I'm doing my best to protect him," she'd say. "I would think his children would appreciate that." My suspicions began during a visit in May. Dad seemed confused when I mentioned our conversation from the week before about updating his investment portfolio. "I don't remember talking about investments," he said, looking genuinely puzzled. Linda quickly intervened. "The medication affects his memory, Michael. The oncologist warned us about this." But Dad's confusion seemed selective. He remembered business details from decades ago perfectly, but couldn't recall recent conversations with his children. It was as if someone was controlling the information flow in both directions. As a financial advisor, I understood the importance of documentation. I began keeping detailed records of our visits, noting Dad's mental state, his statements, and Linda's behavior. I also started using a legal recording app on my phone during our conversations. Oregon is a one-party consent state, so I could legally record conversations I participated in. What I discovered was deeply troubling. Linda spoke differently when she thought Dad couldn't hear her. During one visit, while Dad was napping, she took a phone call in the kitchen. I was in the living room, but the recording picked up her conversation clearly. "Honestly, I wish it would just be over," she said to whoever was on the other end. "This is taking forever, and I'm exhausted. The sooner he goes, the sooner I can start living again." These weren't the words of a devoted wife. They were the calculations of someone waiting for a payday. But the most damning evidence came in July, 4 months before Dad died. Linda thought Dad was asleep when she had a video call with someone she called Danny. I was visiting and had stepped onto the porch to take a business call when I heard her voice through the window. "He's getting more suspicious," she was saying. "Keeps asking questions about the new will. Maybe we should wait until he's more heavily medicated." A pause as she listened to the response. "I know it's risky, but we're talking about $3 million. It's worth the risk if we can get him to sign before his kids catch on." Another pause. "His kids don't suspect anything. They think I'm just a grieving wife. By the time they figure out what happened, it'll be too late." I recorded this entire conversation. Linda was actively conspiring with someone to manipulate Dad's will while he was dying of cancer. That night, I called an emergency meeting with Rachel. I played her the recording, and she was horrified, but not entirely surprised. She'd noticed Linda becoming increasingly possessive and controlling as Dad's condition worsened. "What do we do?" Rachel asked. As a financial advisor, I knew we needed to understand the full scope of Linda's plan. I hired a private investigator to research her background and identify Danny. What we found was enlightening. Linda had been married twice before, both times to significantly older men with substantial assets. Her first husband died of a heart attack 18 months after their marriage, leaving her his retirement accounts. Her second husband divorced her when he discovered she'd been forging his signature on financial documents. Danny turned out to be Daniel Walsh, a lawyer who specialized in contested estate cases. He'd been sanctioned multiple times for ethical violations related to inheritance disputes. The pattern was clear. Linda had done this before, and Walsh was her accomplice. 2 weeks later, I had a conversation with Dad that changed everything. I was visiting alone. Linda was at her book club, when Dad suddenly seemed more alert than he'd been in months. "Michael," he said, looking around to make sure we were alone, "I need to tell you something important." He explained that 2 years earlier, in 2020, he'd established an irrevocable trust naming Rachel and me as beneficiaries. All his major assets, the real estate portfolio, investment accounts, and business interests, had been transferred into this trust. "I knew Linda married me for money," he said quietly. "I'm not stupid, but she made me happy after your mother died, and I thought that was worth something. I just made sure my children were protected." The trust was managed by his longtime attorney, Robert Chen, who had strict instructions not to reveal its existence until after Dad's death. Linda knew nothing about it. "She thinks she's getting everything," Dad continued. "Let her think that. It keeps her motivated to take care of me. But when I'm gone, she'll discover that being my widow comes with a very modest inheritance." Dad had been planning this for years. The trust was legally bulletproof, established when he was in perfect health and of sound mind. Linda would inherit the house they shared and a small savings account, about $75,000 total. Everything else belonged to his children. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Dad's expression grew troubled. "Because Linda's been asking me to sign documents. She says they're medical directives, but I think she's trying to change my estate plan. I need you to make sure nothing happens to the trust." This conversation was recorded like all our recent talks. More importantly, it revealed that Linda was actively trying to manipulate Dad's estate planning during his final months. I immediately contacted Robert Chen to verify the trust status. Everything Dad had told me was accurate. The trust was irrevocable and properly executed. Linda had no legal claim to the assets it contained, but Chen also confirmed my worst fears. "Linda has been calling my office repeatedly," he said. "She's demanding to see your father's will and asking about his estate planning. She seems to believe she's entitled to information about his finances." Chen had refused to provide any information, citing attorney-client privilege, but Linda's persistent inquiries suggested she was planning something significant. I decided to increase my surveillance. Starting in August, I began recording all interactions with Linda, not just conversations with Dad. What I discovered was a systematic campaign to manipulate Dad's final wishes. Linda complained bitterly about his children when she thought he couldn't hear. She expressed frustration with his medical treatments and made detailed plans for spending her inheritance. During one recorded conversation with her sister, she outlined her strategy. "I just need him to sign one more document," she said. "Danny has everything prepared. If James is too weak to read it carefully, that's not my problem." Her sister's response was equally chilling. "What if his kids challenge it?" "They won't," Linda replied confidently. "They'll be too busy grieving to think about legal issues. By the time they realize what happened, I'll have liquidated everything and moved to Costa Rica." In September, 1 month before Dad died, Linda made her move. She arrived at Dad's bedside with a stack of documents and Daniel Walsh. "Just some medical paperwork," she explained to Dad. "Power of attorney updates that the hospital needs." But I was there, recording everything. The documents Walsh presented weren't medical forms. They were attempts to revoke the existing trust and establish a new will, leaving everything to Linda. Dad, heavily medicated and barely conscious, initially began signing where Linda pointed, but something made him pause. "I need to read this first," he said weakly. "You don't need to worry about the details," Linda said, guiding his hand. "It's just standard hospital paperwork." That's when I intervened. "Dad, maybe we should have Robert Chen review these documents first." Linda's face went white. Walsh quickly gathered the papers and suggested they return another time when Dad was feeling better. They never came back. Dad died 3 weeks later, on October 18, 2022, surrounded by his real family. Linda played the grieving widow perfectly, sobbing dramatically and accepting condolences with practiced grace. At the funeral, Linda held court like a Victorian widow, dressed in expensive black clothing and discussing Dad's wishes with fake authority. That's when I heard the conversation that would ultimately seal her fate. She was speaking quietly with her sister near the back of the funeral home. "Finally, all that money is mine," she said with barely concealed satisfaction. "James may have loved his kids, but I made sure they won't see a penny." Her sister's response was revealing. "Are you sure the new will is valid? What if they challenge it?" Linda's smile was cold. "Danny handled everything perfectly. We have witnesses, proper signatures, the whole thing. By the time Michael and Rachel figure out what happened, the money will be long gone." I recorded this entire exchange. Linda had just confessed to estate fraud at her husband's funeral. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday. Robert Chen had arranged to meet with the family at his law office. Linda arrived dressed like she was attending a board meeting. Expensive suit, designer jewelry, clearly expecting to take control of Dad's assets. Rachel and I sat quietly as Chen began the formal reading. Linda had brought Daniel Walsh, who immediately demanded to see all estate documents. "Mrs. Henderson has reason to believe there may be irregularities in the deceased's estate planning," Walsh announced. "We're prepared to challenge any documents that don't reflect Mr. Henderson's true final wishes." Chen smiled politely and opened his file. "Let's begin with the will first, then move to other relevant documents." He read Dad's will aloud. It was short and straightforward. "I leave all my personal effects and any assets not otherwise disposed of to my beloved wife, Linda Henderson." Linda smiled triumphantly. Walsh nodded with satisfaction. They clearly believed this simple will gave Linda control of Dad's entire estate. Then Chen continued. "However, I must note that this will applies only to assets actually owned by James Henderson at the time of his death. He pulled out a thick folder. In 2020, Mr. Henderson established the Henderson Family Trust, transferring all major assets into an irrevocable trust benefiting his 2 children. Linda's face went white. Walsh started shuffling through papers frantically. The total value of trust assets is approximately $3.2 million, Chen continued calmly. Mrs. Henderson's inheritance under the will consists of personal effects, household furnishings, and one joint savings account containing $74,000. The silence in the room was deafening. Walsh was the first to speak. "This is unacceptable. Mrs. Henderson was James's wife. She has a right to more substantial inheritance." Chen's response was measured. "The trust was established 2 years ago when Mr. Henderson was in perfect health. It's legally irrevocable and properly executed. Mrs. Henderson has no legal claim to trust assets." Linda finally found her voice. "This is impossible. James would never cut me out. He loved me. I'm sure he did," Chen replied gently. "Which is why he left you the house and savings account. But he also loved his children and wanted to ensure their financial security." Walsh immediately began making threats about contesting the trust, claiming undue influence and mental incapacity. But Chen was prepared for this. "I should mention," he said, "that Mr. Michael Henderson has provided me with audio recordings of conversations suggesting there may have been attempts to manipulate Mr. Henderson's estate planning during his final illness." I pulled out my phone and played the recording from Linda's funeral conversation. Her own words filled the room. "Finally, all that money is mine. James may have loved his kids, but I made sure they won't see a penny." Linda's face went from white to deep red. Walsh immediately advised her to stop speaking. "This recording also mentions proper signatures and witnesses," I continued. "I believe the district attorney's office would be very interested in investigating potential estate fraud." The meeting ended with Walsh hustling Linda out of the office while she proclaimed her innocence and threatened legal action. But we knew she had no legal standing. The trust was bulletproof, and her own recorded words proved fraudulent intent. 3 days later, Linda moved out of Dad's house, taking only her personal belongings. She never filed any legal challenges to the trust. Daniel Walsh was investigated by the State Bar Association for his role in the scheme. While they couldn't prove he'd helped forge documents, his association with Linda's plan cost him his remaining clients. 6 months after Dad's funeral, we learned that Linda had moved to Arizona and was dating another wealthy widower. Some people never change. The Henderson Family Trust distributed Dad's assets according to his wishes. Rachel took over the real estate development business, and I continued managing the investment portfolio. We kept Dad's company running exactly as he would have wanted. We also used some of the inheritance to establish a scholarship fund in Mom and Dad's memory, supporting students from working-class families who wanted to pursue business degrees. Looking back, I'm struck by Dad's wisdom in planning ahead. He saw Linda's true nature, but chose to handle it through legal preparation rather than confrontation. He got companionship during his final years while protecting his children's inheritance. The recordings I made proved crucial, not just as evidence, but as validation that our suspicions were correct. Linda had married Dad for money, planned to steal our inheritance, and celebrated what she thought was her victory at his funeral. But Dad's love for his children ran deeper than Linda's greed. He'd protected us years before we even knew we needed protection. Today, 3 years later, the real estate company Dad built continues to thrive under Rachel's leadership. I've expanded my financial advisory practice and now specialize in estate planning and elder abuse prevention. We learned that protecting family requires both love and strategy. Dad provided both. Linda got exactly what Dad thought she deserved, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to live extravagantly. It was a fair outcome for someone who provided companionship but planned betrayal. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's simply being smarter than the people trying to take advantage of you. Dad was definitely smarter than Linda. 2 years smarter, as it turned out. The most satisfying part wasn't seeing Linda's shock at the will reading. It was realizing that Dad had loved us enough to protect us before we even knew we needed protection. That's the difference between real family and people who marry into it for money. Real family plans for your future. Gold diggers plan for their own. Dad understood the difference, and he made sure we'd understand it too. In the end, Linda's inheritance trap worked perfectly. She just trapped herself instead of us.